Hey guys, doing a little bit of a different video today. I'm going to be doing a movie review, which is not something I do a whole lot, but in this instance, I think I'm going to make a special exception. So if you saw the short video that I recently posted, you'd know that I just saw the Long Walk movie adaptation, and I'm gonna take my time to review this movie because I won't lie, this was probably one of the most anticipated movies of my life. Now, obviously, you can see the shelf behind me. Stephen King is my favorite author. I've loved him for years, been collecting him for years, and I first read The Long Walk back when I was 16, a sophomore in high school, and ever since I even heard of it, I just fell in love with the story. I fell in love with the concept. I thought this book is like it's so simple yet it's so well put together, and to this day it is my third favorite Stephen King story of all time. The first being It, and the second being The Mist. Now, when I first saw the trailer for this movie, I was very excited, but I was also kind of terrified. I was excited because I had been wanting there to be a movie adaptation ever since I first read it, and the fact that it was finally happening after like decades even of production hell, it just seemed surreal. But I also knew that this was the kind of movie, like if you read the book, you'll know what I mean. But it's such a it's such a meticulously built concept, and a lot of the world building and the character development is kind of reading in between the lines of the story, that I knew that if like an expert wasn't making this, then I felt like it wasn't going to do the book justice. And I'll admit, after I walked out of the theater, I realized that I probably set my expectations too high because, um, I knew that if they didn't like come out with the next Christopher Nolan level blockbuster, I knew that I wasn't going to be fully satisfied. Um, but walking out of the theater, I also knew that the film that they actually ended up with, you could tell that they really cared about the source material and what it was trying to say. And that's probably the biggest praise I can give the movie as an adaptation. Is it felt like they understood the source material and they tried to give you a compelling adaptation. So The Long Walk, for those of you who don't know, and that's probably a lot of you because unfortunately this is kind of one of the more unknown King works, but it's set in a dystopian world where every year a set number of teenage boys enter this marathon called the Long Walk, and all they have to do is walk at a certain pace. If they fall below that pace or just stop walking, they'll get a warning, and after a certain period of time, they'll get another warning. After 3 warnings, if they fail to catch back up, they get shot and killed by soldiers who are following them along the road. Um, and Despite how simple that sounds, part of what I mean, which when I say that this book is very meticulous, is there's a surprising amount of rules that are actually outlined in the story. Like basically any situation that you can think of, there's a rule for it, and a lot of them do result in death. But the person who survives the Long Walk, because there's no finish line to this marathon, it only ends after one person is left. But when the marathon ends, the survivor, he gets basically whatever he wants. Now, there was some debate as to whether or not King meant for it to mean they get one wish or if they get whatever they want for the rest of their lives. I think it's implied that it is for the rest of their lives, however long that might be after doing the marathon. But in the movie, one of the changes they make is the winner gets a cash prize as well as one wish. And now I'm not going to go through every single difference of the movie in the book, just because that would take way too long, and I'm sure other YouTubers are going to do that way before I would be able to. But I will talk about some that I feel like either improve or draw back from the movie. Personally, I feel like that change for the prize kind of took away from the movie, because if because good element of enjoying the story is kind of understanding why these boys would want to sign up for the long walk, knowing how horrible it actually is. And um, and a lot of that, a good amount of that is explained through the world building, because this is set in the United States in a dystopian future, or it could be a future, but actually, like YouTuber Canto1408's theory, that this book takes place in an alternate timeline, mainly because there's a part where they talk about World War II, and they mention things that didn't actually happen in real life, as well as how in this universe, World War II lasted a lot longer than it actually did. And um, and as you can imagine, the war did a lot of damage to the United States, to the point where it basically became, if not a second world country, then a third world country, where a lot of people are kind of desperate to find a way out, and a lot of people, they kind of do see the long walk as their way out. And combine that with the fact that if you win the long walk in the book, you get whatever you want for the rest of your life. It's a lot easier, at least for me, to understand why these boys would want to do that. A couple other differences that the movie makes to the actual marathon is, in the book you have 100 boys, but in the movie it's 50 boys. I felt like that was actually kind of a smart decision, because while admittedly 50 isn't as, I guess, interesting as 100, it does provide a little more context, because now, instead of just being a random selection, it's one boy from each state, and each boy kind of acts as that state's representation. Another change is, in the book it was 4 miles an hour, in the movie it's 3 miles an hour, and I felt like that was also a smart decision, because if you've ever tried walking 4 miles an hour for an extended period of time, you would know that not only is it very hard, but doing it for as long as they do in the marathon, it's basically inhuman. I actually feel like it would have been better if they knocked it down to 2 miles an hour, because a lot of these boys are implied to be your average everyday teenager, and 2 miles an hour for me is a lot more believable than 3 miles an hour. Also in the movie, the mileage that they cover, as well as their pace, is tracked by a type of watch on their wrists. I don't know what you call it, but it keeps track of that stuff, and that actually answers a kind of a big plot hole of the book, which is, how the heck are these soldiers keeping track of each boy's pace, and how are they keeping track of how far they've come? Well, the watches in the movie answer that question for you. Something else interesting about the movie is, it's shot in a way, or I should say structured in a way, where it all feels continuous. You don't get a whole lot of, I mean, you get some time leaps, but a lot of it looks like it's kind of one scene placed in front of the other. And I felt like that was smart, because if you were doing this in real life, everything would just seem continuous. There wouldn't be any breaks. And throughout the movie, in the bottom corner of the screen, you get these occasional messages of how far they've actually covered. I think the last one they mentioned was mile 380. It could have been 360 though, which is also a little different from the book, because in the book I believe it was 450 miles that they covered, which again, knocking it down a little bit to 380, that is a bit more believable. Also, one praise/criticism that I want to give the movie is, they do a good job with keeping the story interesting, despite it being so simple. Like a lot of good survival horror movies will do that. Like, three I can think of off the top of my head are Alfred Hitchcock's Rope, Buried with Ryan Reynolds, and then Frozen, the 2010 movie, not the 2012 movie, or was it 2013? I don't know. And for the most part, I think that was really well done, but one technique that they used that I wish they didn't was actually the pacing. And because you are kind of seeing the same thing over and over again, they try to I guess make it more interesting by pushing things along. And at first at first it's kind of all right, but then when you go from like mile 15 all the way to mile 50, my thought was, well, what the heck happened in between that? Like that's such a far jump of time, especially if you read the book. The book is very slow paced, and a and it fills in the blanks by giving you insight to the characters and also describing what's kind of on the land around them. I kind of wish the movie did more of that. And despite the movie being 2 hours, because of the pacing issue, I kind of felt like it wasn't long enough. Now, talking a little bit about the characters, I will admit for some these characters might not be for everybody, but I think the story does a good job of showing both how they're different from each other as well as kind of how they develop throughout the story. Um, because you have this main group of characters, and for the most part they are kind of similar, but they all have their own reasons as to why they wanted to participate. Um, and so, some are a bit unique from the book. In fact, in the book, you don't get to know why a lot of the boys actually sign up. But I found the reasons kind of, if not compelling, then interesting, because Garrity has his own reasons for signing up for the marathon, which I won't spoil. Um, Peter McVries, he kind of signs up basically because he's got nothing left to lose, and he's kind of hoping that if he does win, then he can try to use his wish to create a better tomorrow. Um, the character Art Baker, he says that he's just there to walk and make some friends, which on the surface is kind of sweet, but you also have to ask yourself, is that not a dumb reason to sign up? Because if you do decide to make friends in this marathon, every friend that you make, either you're gonna watch them die or they're gonna watch you die, and it kind of makes you look at characters like Barkovich and wonder, are they not the smart ones for trying not to make friends? And speaking of Barkovich, he is your kind of your bully archetype in the story. Uh, he uh, he does start off very antagonistic, but um, throughout the movie, he does develop into not necessarily a likable character, but more of a redeemable character, because after he sees the consequences of his actions, he does kind of shut up and let the others be. Um, and the thing that all these characters have in common is when they start out, they're super optimistic. They're like, "Yeah, I'm gonna win. I'm gonna make a whole bunch of money." But as they go on, as you would naturally expect, they get more tired. They get more grueling. They start to question, why did I even do this? Like they didn't expect it to be as bad as it actually is, and because of that, you do get some moments where the characters have these kind of philosophical conversations, both about the concept of life and death as well as why this marathon is even here in the first place, and they kind of reflect a little bit on their totalitarian government. And speaking of that, that does kind of lead into my next topic, which is the world building. Now, again, in the book, the world building is very much read in between the lines and kind of put the pieces together, but in the movie, they do make it a little more explicit, which I actually think was smart because, again, if you really want to enjoy the story, you kind of have to understand the context around it. But basically, uh, the these boys are set in a futuristic United States, or it could be an alternate universe United States where after World War II, or at least in the book, it was after World War II, the United States was left in a state where if it wouldn't be considered a second world country, it would be a third world country, and a lot of people were kind of left desperate to escape, and because of that, the government completely reformed. They made it more militaristic. They made it tougher and meaner, and they kind of got rid of their traditional government in favor of having the military rule everything. I suppose a country to compare this to would maybe be North Korea. Uh, could be Russia. I'm not entirely sure. And uh, and the main antagonist in the story, the Major, not only is he the head of the military, but he's the head of the entire country. Now, something else about the Major is in the movie he's played by Mark Hamill, which I gotta say, Mark Hamill's performance was probably my biggest surprise throughout the movie because I'm so used to him playing hero characters like Luke Skywalker or bad but fun and witty characters like the Joker that seeing him in this role, it was kind of like Whiplash because he's just the Major in this story is just an evil, mean person. He's he's like uh, he's like the government brutality personified, and seeing that performance come out of Mark Hamill, that was very surprising. I do think he gives the best performance in the movie because of that. But I'm also going to use him to talk a little more about what kind of world they're set in. Now, if you've read stories like say 1984 or even V for Vendetta, you would find some similarities because uh, in this world there's a lot of things that are heavily regulated, a lot of things that are banned. Um, Civil rights and civil liberties aren't really a thing anymore, uh, and death, or I should say capital punishment, is just abundant throughout the story. The characters in the book actually say the squads to refer to that, um, and because they've kind of lost their freedom of speech, if anybody talks badly about the government or the Major or the Long Walk, they get sent to the squads. If they get caught with banned material, they get sent to the squads. They try if they interfere at all with the Long Walk, they get sent to the squads. In fact, there's one scene in the book where this dog, she comes out onto the road and the soldiers shoot it, and then the family that um, I guess allowed the dog to get away from them, they get sent because they technically interfered with the Long Walk. So that kind of gives you an idea of how brutal the story actually is, also and also with the book's government style, you get a sense uh, that sovereign states don't really exist anymore. Everything is unified, and the ruler of that is the Major. They so like legislation, due process, those don't exist anymore. It's all under a dictatorship that's run by the Major. So that kind of gives you an idea of how, I guess, larger than life this character actually is. And something else we'll praise the movie for is it tries not to shy away from the actual bleakness of the story, because this story is very dark and it's actually kind of violent. Well, not violent in the sense that people are fighting each other, but more violent in the sense of what actually happens and kind of the gore you see. I'm sure the thing everyone's going to talk about from this movie is one of the characters. He twists his ankle to the point that he actually breaks it, but he still continues walking. And there's this very explicit shot where he's basically just walking on the stump of his leg because his foot is bent at a 90-degree angle. It's very graphic. Another point in the story, one of the kids, he collapses to the road, but the road actually scrapes the side of his face, and it also cuts his hands, so he's bleeding a lot. One of the characters, Hank Olson, he tries to uh, he kind of tries to interfere with the walk to get himself out, and kind of the punishment for that is he doesn't get shot in the head, a quick and easy death. The soldiers shoot him in the core area, and they just let him bleed out. So that kind of gives you the idea, or an idea, of how brutal the story actually is. But one criticism I will kind of throw out, and I know this is going to sound mean, but I actually kind of wish it was more brutal, especially in the sense of weather. Now, one of the rules of the Long Walk is the marathon does not stop for anything, let alone weather. These boys have to continue walking through any conditions. And I feel like it would have made it more compelling if they actually showed how brutal it could actually get. Now, granted, the story I don't think the story ever says what time of year the walk actually takes place, but I think it's implied to either be summer or spring. And there are a few points in the movie where it does start raining, and obviously that's bad. Um, although it very quickly transitions to a sunny day, just the kind of weather you would expect if you were kind of out for a walk. And something else I'm gonna show. So, uh, so this edition of The Long Walk, if you live in the U.S., this is probably what you're gonna see if you go into a bookstore. But if you take a look at that artwork, I mean, doesn't that landscape and weather look absolutely barren and just disturbing? I feel like if they recreated something like that, I think that would have made it more of a compelling story, especially since The Long Walk is arguably a horror story. Like there's a lot of horror elements in it, but it's just little details like that that I think would have made it. I think would have made it more compelling. Um, another thing something else that I thought they kind of not really shied away from, but didn't go as far as I think they should have. So as you can imagine, as this marathon goes on, a lot of the boys, they start to go kind of insane from both lack of sleep, exhaustion, and seeing everyone die around them. And a good number of them actually do take their own lives. The main reason that they give in the movie was, if I'm going to die, it's going to be on my own terms. And one of the characters in the book, he gets to the point where he just can't take it anymore, and he actually tears out his own throat. In the movie, they like they have a scene where they kind of do that, and you know what it's referencing from the book, but instead of having the kid tear out his throat, he takes a spoon and he actually stabs himself a few times in the neck, which is graphic, but I'm like, I feel like you should have gone further to really emphasize how far gone these boys are actually getting. Another point that I think they kind of shied away from was, like in the book, you get a few kids that are starting to walk barefoot, either because they feel like it'd be easier or because their shoes are bothering them too much. In the movie, you have the protagonist Ray Garrity do that. Is, as you can imagine, walking for miles on end on pavement and without shoes, that would probably cut up your feet pretty badly. And they didn't really show that in the movie. It just kind of happens, and then they kind of move on. Again, and I know this sounds mean, but I feel like if you really want to get the kind of the point of the story across, you need to show these boys in a lot of pain. That being said, probably the second biggest praise I can give this movie is, well, they didn't really show the disturbing elements so much in physical pain or landscape. They do in the emotional delivery of the actors as well as the writers. There are several points in this movie where the characters had these emotional breakdowns. They open up to each other about why they're doing this, how they're feeling inside, and I think it's really well done. And these actors give really great performances. Like you believe that you believe that these actors are these characters, and you want all these characters to make it, even though you know they're not going to. And that leads to another change from the book to the movie. In the in the book, the character of Peter McVries, he joins the Long Walk because he was basically suicidal after he broke up with his girlfriend, and he lost his job, and he was like, I got nothing left to lose, so why not? In the movie, they changed that a little bit. There's one point where he gets asked if he has a girlfriend. He doesn't really say anything, so it's implied that something bad happened. But the movie actually goes further in giving him a really tough backstory that it kind of does build the world up a little bit. But how it compels this character is, if he wins, he wants to use his wish to try to make a better tomorrow for people just like him. And I actually like that change a lot, because it just made him that much more of a compelling character. And I will say the movie did successfully make Peter McVries my personal favorite character. Also, I think another smart thing that the movie did in kind of setting up these characters, reacting to the world around them, is like the movie is very vulgar, and I can foresee some people complaining about that, like, oh, these writers don't know how to write if they're only writing swear words. But I mean, in the book, that is also very vulgar, but I think it works because one, that's kind of how boys banter. They'll swear a lot, they'll make fun of each other, but it also makes sense because they're kind of just reflecting the world around them. Like they grew up in this very uh, totalitarianistic government, and it's implied that a lot of these boys came from poor families. And I think the way that they talk to each other, the way they interact with each other, I thought that was kind of a smart way of implying what kind of attitude that these people have in the world that they're in. And you do kind of get that attention to detail from some of the side characters because as the movie goes on, there are several civilians that just kind of watch the walk from their property. Now in the book, it's a lot more optimistic. I mean, think of every perk that celebrities get. Um, that's basically given to the long walkers simply because they're in the marathon, and there's there's a lot more focus of celebration from people on the sidelines. But in the movie, it is very I don't know if bleak is the right word, but just kind of neutral, and even sometimes depressing because um, with a few exceptions, a lot of the people they don't. While they're watching the marathon, they just kind of stare. There's no celebration, uh, no real action. They just kind of are watching. And there's one scene where you have this you have this person on the sidelines. He has an amputated leg, and he's also just kind of watching. Um, I'm not entirely sure if I like that change more or if I like it less because, well, one, it does further kind of set up the world, especially if you've never read the book before, and it kind and you and it does further emphasize how horrible the marathon actually is. But you could also say that the way the book handled it was better because um, part of that fame and notoriety is a large part of what compelled these boys to sign up, and you and there are several points in the book where the characters actually take advantage of all the fame that they're getting, even if it does get them killed. I'm not going to spoil it, but if you've read the book, you know what I mean. And I think that kind of ties back into why Stephen King wrote the book in the first place. So, I mean, everyone knows the rumor that The Long Walk was supposed to be kind of a metaphor for Vietnam, and I don't know if that's something Stephen King ever confirmed or denied, but if you do believe that, it does make the story a lot easier to digest because of how many similarities there are in the metaphors. Uh, but a big part of that is you might be wondering why society accepts this as normal. Um, but if you look out in the real world, I mean, I think we can all agree that war is horrible, but it's also something that we've kind of just accepted as normal because it's been going on for so long, and something that we also shroud in celebration and heroism to kind of distract from the crimes that we're actually putting on to our fellow man. And I felt like that was a really good world building tool in the book. And if you still want to say that the Long Walk takes place in the future, like if they're talking about a future war that kind of destroys America, then you could still see it as an anti-war movie. Now, probably the last thing I wanted to talk about with this movie is, I think, my main criticism, and if I have to stand on a mountain alone with this, then I'm prepared to. But um, I think the best way to put it is I wish the production values were higher because um, I mean, I'm sure this was intentional, but the way the movie was shot, it feels very enclosed and kind of just onward looking. Like they wanted to give you the impression that you're there you're there on this walk with these boys, but kind of the drawbacks of that is you don't really get a lot of shot variety, especially when you're trying to emphasize how the environment is interacting with these boys. Like if they had a lot of long shots or shots looking further down the road that could maybe foreshadow things that were going to happen. I think that would have made the movie a little more interesting because if you're not paying attention to the characters, it's kind of just the same thing over and over again. And granted, you do get some very pretty scenery changes, but for the most part, it feels very isolating. Especially if you look back to the book where they do go through several small towns as they traverse through several states. But another thing that I think they kind of missed the mark on when it came to a little more variety in the production was actually the mental part of the story, because I mean, I'm sure you've all seen movies where characters have mental breakdowns and you get a lot of shaky, unfocused cam. You get a lot of lighting effects, and you maybe even have scenes where you go into the character's mind to kind of see what they're thinking and what they're dealing with. I feel like The Long Walk would have been the perfect movie for that um, because after you start to ignore the physical part of this marathon, the mental part of this marathon is really what makes the story very dark and really what kind of drives these boys to either push on or end things. And I think the closest thing that we get to that is at the end of the movie. Now, I'm not spoiling the end of the movie, although I will say that they do significantly change the ending of the movie. But it ends on a very, very implied or suggested message and foreshadowing, and I really wish there was more of that, because not only does it kind of give the audience and the characters a chance to reflect on everything, but if things were a little more open to interpretation as to what exactly is happening, I think that really could have worked for the characters. It would have given you kind of a deeper connection to them. So at the end of it all, what am I trying to say? What I'm saying is The Long Walk is a great movie, especially if you have no context of the book at all and you just want to see something that can introduce you to the story. I think the movie does a great job with that, but I feel like at the end of it, especially if you have read the book, it's gonna leave you wanting a little more. Um, I think the best way I can describe kind of the feel for this movie as someone who has read the book is if you gave a fan film adaptation of The Long Walk, if you gave that a large budget and then released that theatrically, to me that's kind of what it feels like. And I don't mean that as an entire criticism, because I've seen fan film adaptations that are really good, but for The Long Walk, for a story that was so important to me personally, I really wish we got something bigger. But all in all, I'm sure this movie will be enough for most people. And if you haven't seen it, I actually do recommend it. And those are my thoughts on The Long Walk movie.